Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and I'm here today with Scott. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, Kate. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
My goodness, well, it's such a treat to have you here. You have several cubes in your docket that are really interesting and really exciting. You also do some event coordination and just a lot of positive rabble rousing up in the New York area. So excited to visit some and to explore some of what you're doing.
Yeah, same here. I can't wait.
Let's start with kind of a broad idea here. Why cubes, Scott? What got you into that space?
So it's interesting. I feel like I can't talk about YQ without talking about my origins in Magic. As you noted, I'm on the East Coast. I grew up just outside of New York City, and I, as a mid millennial, grew up at like a really interesting point of like message board culture. And I was on this vintage specific forum called the Mana Drain. And basically, the Mana Drain ran a sort of like series of proxy friendly tournaments up and down the East Coast in vintage. This is back like in like pre Mirrodin for context. And it was a really great time, but I took a break after doing that for a few years and just kind of playing kitchen table to focus on school, focus on all other aspects of my life. And I didn't come back to Magic until 2019. And this was around Eldraine, and I experienced quite a bit of culture shock where I learned about all these new formats. It wasn't type 1 and type 2. It was vintage and it was standard and these this verbiage that I'd never heard before. So I started playing with a friend that I knew here through New York City nightlife. We like would DJ together, and we'd always joke and like yearn to play Magic again. We started, with a couple commander decks. Didn't even know how planeswalkers worked. It was a little bit of it was a little bit of a mess. I definitely attacked with a walker that was not a Gideon, so forgive me for that. But all this to say, with this sort of like obsession and exacerbated by the fact we were all under lockdown for a significant period of time, I just started consuming as much Magic content as possible on YouTube. And I came across, as so many other folks did, an LSV or a Reed Duke vintage cube draft, and I just became enamored. I was like, okay, this is so interesting. I never drafted when I was playing vintage, so I was like, this is a new angle to approach the game, and it feels a little more DIY, a little more punk. And that sentiment only escalated once I learned that there are cubes that are not just, vintage cube. And I started designing my own and toying around with them. And it's been a real journey, but I think it really resonates with my sort of values as an individual of just like unique self-expression, stylistic expression, and a little bit left of that which is quote unquote the norm, and this open box to show what you think a certain type of magic is. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that description. I think there's something that I really enjoy about you going from what we would now call vintage into vintage draft and kind of skipping over so much in between. you know,
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
constructed Moxen into drafted Moxen, somehow very different.
yeah. Yeah, it's like I went from hoping I would draw my ancestral to hoping I'd even see an ancestral in the draft. It's a bit of a culture shock, but I like the tension. Looking back is how I describe it, right? Not being guaranteed to have these powerful things. It was energizing, and it built this anticipation that just like you never knew what was going to come next. It was great.
Did you ever consider building a vintage cube, or did you quickly jump to other things?
I will be vulnerable and admit I did myself build like one-to-one Magic Online vintage cube with proxies, and
I mean, it's tough to do it the real way.
it turns out you need a tremendous amount of resources. And I as I mentioned, during the pandemic I was unemployed for a little over 2 years during that time period, so I most certainly did not have the means to be buying any Power 9. That's
Yeah.
for sure. Still don't, but it it was very scrappy in that way. And then I realized, oh wait, I can curate these things, I can have different treatments. But it is just funny that that jump between format to format, I didn't even connect it was a lateral. But that was technically my first cube, which ultimately, I think I've officially sold off the last little dregs of it to Tales of Adventure. Thank you, Michael and crew, just
Good,
to
good.
fund other cube adventures and projects. Yeah.
Well, no, that's excellent. So certainly this wasn't the first project you worked on, but one of the ones I wanted to unpack with you today is called The Garden, which is very different from, I would say, a traditional vintage cube, perhaps. Do you want to give us an overview or an elevator pitch for The Garden?
Yeah, I think the garden is inspired by specifically two cubes. It was like many of my cubes birthed off of a trip to CubeCon. I played a good friend of mine from the Baltimore crew, Daniel's Reading Rainbow Cube, and I've been obsessed with this cube since the first time I played it. For those who don't know, you start with Pillar of the Parents in play. Every card, including your lands, are gold, right? There's no monocolor cards. You're playing turn one at turn two, and I was really enamored with this sort of warping of the color pie, right? I thought that was so
Yes.
intriguing. I thought the technology of like having a land enter already in play, like starting the game with a land already in play, was really radical to me. And this was also around the time that Zach Barish introduced the Cascade Cube, which I think for me was like the real game changer of sort of like what is now talked about as clown shoes cubes or emblem cubes, right? But
Hmm.
it recontextualized so much that I just was truly blown away. Like my jaw dropped the first time I drafted it, and every time I would go 1-2-0-3, but I would just be so inspired. My thoughts would be so provoked that I felt like I wanted to emulate what these two cubes did in a different way. The way I tried to do this was the original design of the garden, which is, and this is still true. The way the garden works is you start with Lotus Field as your turn one land drop, right? Bones and I and many other people are still workshopping the best way to explain this because, as we all know, that would mean you'd have zero lands in play. But effectively, just picture it as you get Lotus Field as your turn one land drop. You don't get to play a second land on top of that. You don't sacrifice it to itself. You just have three of any color starting from turn one and going forward. And basically, the original goal was I wanted a sort of playground for these cards I couldn't put into my other cubes, like Mertz Cube and Curio Cube, which are more eternal cubes, focusing on different design goals, right? But I was so not obsessed with the frequency in which I had these low curving environments where it was just one drop into two drop into three drop into good game, right? I wanted to see an environment in my sort of repertoire where you could resolve a seven drop, you could resolve a six drop, and they had places to be within my collection. Everybody loves Primeval Titan, but it is very likely you could already be dead by the time you're resolving it, right?
Yeah.
So that was really like the original assignment I gave myself, is like make a cube where six and seven drops are reasonable.
And they aren't just reanimator targets, for example.
Yeah, it's actually like I am, and still to this day, pretty adamant that like Reanimator in its traditional sense is not something I want in this environment. Like there is, and we'll get to this, like some milling themes and these other things, right? But my real goal is like you were playing fair magic at an accelerated curve, right? Or an escalated curve, maybe, because the way it started was nothing in the cube was below three, right? It started as like Seasoned Pyromancer was your one drop, right? And
Yeah.
then four into Thrun, right? And then five into etc.
Yeah, I was going to ask a little bit about mana curve because you would expect, oh hey, you start at 3 mana, wouldn't the curve start at 3 mana? And it sure does not.
Yeah, so transparently, there's been, I would say at this point, seven different versions of this environment. I have had a lot of trouble with this. I spoke about it in Lucky Paper's sort of year end roundup, where they asked organizers like myself and Ollie and other folks who you've talked with about like what our year was. And one thing that I was really struggling with is sort of whatever writer's block is for cube design, right? And I was
There's got to be
struggling.
a fancy German word for this.
I know. I always think that, Kate, and I can't find it. But if any engagement bait, if any listeners know it, please let us know in the comments.
There you go.
But I kept trying and I kept trying, and we ran a printer paper version of it at Upkeep once, and one player was chancellor of the annexing on turn zero. One player was playing zero lands and all 3 and 4 drops with like a couple mana rocks. It was not what my design goals had intended, right?
That sounds wild.
It was wild in a very derogatory way, right? Like games just did not stand a chance. It was not engaging or interactive. And I felt even worse as the designer. And I think every designer, well, let me not speak in such extremes. I know I, as a designer, get really excited. I feel great about the cube and I'll bring it somewhere or play it with like a pod of friends or trusted folks. And it will go so poorly and I will feel so embarrassed and bad. And then the truth is I just have actually had a really great learning experience where it's like, all right, I can turn these dials. These things I did not realize were actually design mistakes for me as the designer. And now I can kind of go back to the drawing board. And this happened so many times, right? First version was nothing below 3. And then multiple versions later, I arrived at a point where non creature spells were effectively, 0 to 7. But when it came to creatures, it still was 3 and up. And that was okay, but it didn't really achieve what I wanted to. And then ultimately, I kind of threw out that actual restriction after having like multiple conversations about this with Zach Barish, who's like a great friend and a really, if I had to say there's any person who's helped me get better with this, I have to give a lot of credit to Zach Barish and Dan Schneider, particularly. Those two just like really help me when I get into these writer block scenarios, these cube blockages. They have these inspired ideas and takes that give me the seed that kind of blossoms into what the final form of these environments end up being.
How good to have friends that can push you that way too, that are going to, they'll endure the bad pass and then give you tools to make it better.
Exactly, right? And I think I'm really spoiled in that like I have some really talented cube designers nearby, but like I'm sure everyone listening, all of us in the cube community, right? We have that group of 7 other people, or whether it be on Discord or in person, right? But once someone's played it, that will help us dial in on what we're trying to do. And I feel really fortunate that we have like a community like that here in New York and that it's been so effective. I can't talk about this cube getting to where it needs to be without talking about our like mutual friend Bones, because I had, I'll be real, a pretty rough go at KubeCon this past year to the point I was feeling uninspired. I was not playing my best, and I just found myself in a little bit of a rut on like one of the last moments of the weekend. And it was the first time Bones and I got to like just hang out for a couple minutes that trip and chit chat. And I was talking to him about the garden because he'd probably seen it on social media or just like me moaning about it in Discord. And I was like, can you help me like figure out what would you do differently? And he gave me this like seed that I'm now spreading as much as I can, which is just design the core, the 180 card 4-person version of that cube, right? And it was such an unlock moment for me where I just add and add and add and add, and I'd hit these sort of like 600 card lists, and then I'm like, all right, time to whittle down, like with an extreme headache, just like thinking about it. And editing is like one of my worst skills, but when he reframed it that way, it all clicked, and I was just like, this is what I like. I copied the list and I deleted things until I reached like that core 180 cards, and then it all came together. And I just I felt like I had like a complete flood of inspiration. I just started clicking and clacking, and the list is around 400 something right now, 461 to be exact, and it just came together the second I reached that core. I was just like, these are the things I need to focus on. It was really helpful.
Yeah, I don't want that to be a throwaway thing either to say like, well, yeah, 180 is half of 360, but that sounds so much more accessible. Or like to say, what are the most important things to be building toward?
Yeah, it's like what's important to me, like, and this is a similar frame up to something Zach said to me once, which is like, what are the cards or things you want to be good in this environment, right? We talked for a brief second about my cube, the Curio cube. I was so stuck on that, and I knew that I wanted XYZ to be good, but I couldn't figure it out, and Zach helped me drill down to that. But Bones said the same thing in a different way that I think compounds with that same advice in a way that's given me this really great like tool belt of like, when I'm a little too in my own head, like, hold on, step back. What is this? What is that? And let's calm down.
Well, let's look at a little bit of what that is practically, because I know for the garden, you're starting with a Lotus Field in play, or functionally as your first land drop. That means things like Color Pie look very different. Things like Mana Curve look very different.
Yeah.
Let's start with maybe color balance. How do you approach color balance in a cube like this?
So I'm going to be really honest with you. If you look at the list on Cube Cobra, it has sort of like a spreadsheet aesthetic that you see in a lot of these eternal, like high power cubes where white is maybe the least, blue is the most. But that just was coincidentally how these things came together. I did not want to be fragile about that in this environment because color is almost, I don't want to use a word like meaningless, but color is so much less important when you get to subtract 3 pips. And that was a big piece of like, I guess, technology that I was inspired from reading Rainbow was like you get to delete a pip off of your gold cards with your Pillar of the Parents. So your deck could be mono green, but you have Gruul, Golgari, etc., right, in the same deck, but you're always going to be playing a land and tapping those two. And this
Yes.
was a similar solution, but at the same time, you're not going to be playing Peer to the Abyss and I don't know, Annoyed Altasaur in the same deck.
Right. I know I'm noticing there are a couple cards like there's the Niv Mizzet that is two triple colors of different directions that you have to really lean into. But by and large, a lot of these are pretty accessible otherwise.
Yeah, and I think as I've done different drafts and drafted with different people, like interesting suggestions arise, right? Bones, when he came out here to New York and was generous enough to help run Cube for a Cause with me and Judge Robin, we ran a draft of it after hours, and he built what was basically like mono white, or like Orzov. Like it was brutal. He really dismantled me in the most impressive way I've seen in this environment. But when we sat down together after it, we were looking, and he put me onto things like cleave cards, which I'd had like one or two of. But there's just these interesting things that get to find space in this environment, which is my goal, that don't get to live in other places. Dan Schneider also, like at one of the drafts we hosted at my house, was like, "Hey, I drafted what is basically the perfect Karuga deck because Karuga is not free, but really empowered in an environment where you do have a higher density of 4, 5, 6, 7 drops, right?"
Probably the best Karugas looked in any list.
I would argue that, and basically he was like, I think, you have a lands theme, you have these other themes, you could add the green overlord, the blue overlord, because I already had the black overlord. There's just these sort of things that you get tunnel vision, and each draft kind of unlocks more of them. But to the point of color, right? It's more about what your deck is trying to do than what colors you're playing. Like every deck in this environment is going to feel like a storm deck, even if you are the token machine deck where you're running Chatterfang and all these really powerful like Modern Horizons 3 cards, right? Where you've got Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride, Ajani. These things are just like more and more and more creatures. Pollen Shield Hair, Regal Bunnicorn, right? There's just like a lot of you will dump out your entire hand, and then you could play your equivalent of like a Treasure Cruise or whatever, your card advantage spell in your mono quote unquote white deck. It creates a lot of texture during the draft where you might end up with Splinter Twin Amulet Titan as a deck, which is one lane I find myself in often, but it's totally valid because you could end up with Kiki and Primetime on the same board state. You could end up with Kiki and Conscripts or Titan and Amulet. But the decks don't feel at odds with one another somehow. I can't explain it. It doesn't look right when you look at the deck pictures, but it does work in this odd sort of Rube Goldberg-y way, as people say.
So then within that, you're thinking about color identity and with a little more of an open hand, I suppose. Does that mean that 5 color is something to just kind of be expected to happen, or is that something you're trying to avoid?
I'm definitely not trying to avoid it. I'm open to it because oftentimes most decks can and will be 5 color-ish. But I think it's more about like what base colors you are, because you will have that scenario where you're in the Reading Rainbow where you're agonizing over, am I blue red or am I blue green, right? You're going to wonder what basic lands you put into your deck after this draft. You're going to wonder how many basic lands you put into your deck after this draft. But I think gold cards usually are, I feel like, a big thing that pile into this 5 color good stuff. But in this environment, your gold cards are going to be some of the hardest things you cast because it requires different color pips. And I try to make that easier with a set of signets and the filter lands in each color pair. But I think five color good stuff is not there in the way you're used to seeing, which is, I think, ultimately my solution for this. But it does exist, and I'm okay with that.
Something else in that space I wanted to think on was often when you have these cubes that embrace radical recontextualization, you see a lot of unfamiliar cards. And there certainly are your share of them here, but there's also a lot of things, as you've already listed, that are very familiar. I would have expected it to look very different with this kind of setup. What drew you to some more familiar options?
Yeah, so I think those familiar options give you sort of like life vests. They can function as signals, right? I hate to keep leaning on the white section, right? But like these Modern Horizons 3 cards tell you that like I can basically play Boros energy in this format. Things like Liliana of the Veil actually were really important to me to have as this sort of like this tent pole of like, hey, I know what Liliana does in a normal context, but I really want to see what it does here when it's a one drop. It's an extreme example because I've been proven wrong where I'm like, I think it's totally fine. And people are like, oh no, that's crazy and really gross. You need to not so much watch list, but it's just like that is actually like one of the areas that the radical recontextualization really can show and jump out at you. But I like that there are these things that give you this sort of baseline of magic that is familiar, and ultimately your decks will feel like familiar magic decks. They're just going to be these really like juiced up versions, right? You're going to be playing Turbo Ramp, you're going to be playing tokens, right? Like these identities that exist within the color pie do exist here, but they're a little warped. There's just like familiar themes that you'll see in these macro archetypal and like eternal cubes, but you just have a different engine to empower them versus say like Power 9. Because it does, this was ultimately my goal, was to create a vintage like experience, because I didn't touch on this when we were talking, but I played Storm specifically. I was like a real like tendril sicko. I wasn't happy unless I was tendrils of agonying somebody, and I needed a cube where I could do that.
Hey, Scott, it's been great having you on. Thank you so much for being here. No, it's okay. As a Storm player, I'll forgive you.
Thank you. I was like, oh no.
No, 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 but like that makes sense. Finding a home for a mechanic like that is notoriously difficult to pull off.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about this environment is I have a lot of cards that like we use vocabulary or verbiage of like extremely parasitic in different contexts, where in here, because your mana is just so altered, it feels less hostile. Like a friend of mine, Patrick, from the Baltimore Play Group as well, drafted this extremely sick, what was effectively a Golgari Storm deck that I didn't even know existed, where he had the like, what is it? It's Gravecrawler and Warren Soul Trader, that combo,
Oh
and
yeah.
then would just resolve Chatterstorm. And it's like, all right, you have 4 life and 16 squirrels. What am I gonna do? And that flexibility and modularity for these normally parasitic things are really interesting, because Gravecrawler is totally justifiable in like the self mill black green deck, but it can be in a storm deck if you have this sort of package of cards.
And it's so funny to think of Gravecrawler as like not just a turn one play, but potentially one of three turn one plays that you can make on the same
Yeah,
turn.
it's a little gross in that way, where like I've fortunately never seen this happen, but my biggest fear is someone actually curves Guide of Souls, Esper Sentinel, Ocelot Pride on like one on turn one. It's not happened yet. I fear that day, but you'll see things where I myself have gone like turn one twiddle, and we haven't even talked about the twiddle effects, but those are a really crucial feature of this environment, right? Because effectively there are dark rituals in every color, because twiddle generates you two of whatever the original color mana was. So like if you're using Dream's Grip or Twiddle, it'll be two blue mana you'll have floating. Or there's Burst of Energy in white, or Emerald Charm in green, right? There's these twiddle effects that allow you to have these explosive turn ones where you can have with relative ease, like I don't know, Overlord of the Hauntwoods, like full retail, right? Or Terror of the Peaks, or just like these really challenging to interact with things, or Grief and duress. Like there are these really busted turns that can happen, but they're not guaranteed, and the games are a little swingy in that way. But if you are looking for that hybrid of like classic vintage and modern vintage play pattern, I think you might be happy with what you find here.
Well, yeah, and I know Twiddle type effects with Lotus Field is a real competitive deck and has been at different times. But I imagine those are the sorts of things that are easy to miss in a draft your first time and probably impossible to pass after the first time.
Yeah. So I always try to tell folks like this may look like a very like normal or passable card, but please know that these are high priority picks depending on how you evaluate it. But to your point of first draft and second draft, what's been most interesting about this environment is seeing how people's perceptions of what to do is that is good changes. Some folks will be all about Storm the first two drafts, and then they'll switch. My friend Gabor does this where they did Storm Control the first two drafts, and then they're like, all right, I think tokens or creatures is like one of the best things to be doing here, and they drafted that the past couple times. But some folks will believe Goblin Charbelcher is the best thing, which you can do in a very surprising way in this format because you can play much like that first draft that went awry. You can play zero lands if you're feeling really bold, but it's not exactly easy.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that you've allowed that to be an option, that it's not, hey, this was so far afield, but to say, hey, if you want to be that brave, if you want to try to make this work, more power to you.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those like I like to think of them as like stretch goals, right? But I will say Belcher
That's
is
a
one of
good turn of
those
phrase.
things. Yeah, it's one of those things that I do worry about because it's not free, but it's not free.
Yeah, with enough ways to your dark rituals, your your twiddle effects, you're able to get those.
Yeah, exactly. And signets don't help either.
Yeah. So in the same way that it may be difficult for players to assess on the front end, how about for you making changes to this environment with so much available at your fingertips? How do you go about that process?
Yeah, if that's something that I'm still like living with and learning each time like a new set comes out. I've been fortunate that this sort of epiphany of like this is what it's supposed to look like has come over basically like November, December, where we've had not many new releases, and Ether Drift is a pretty specific set, which did have a lot of stuff for this format, but it's like I look at the sort of themes that I want to be supported in this, right? It's like I'll always be looking for good land card, like good landfall or lands type archetypes, good graveyard themes, good ramp cards, things that benefit Storm, but I'm trying to be very specific about that and intentional. You'll look at new disruption spells, but like ultimately, like I'm looking at this through a much more restrained lens than say like the Curio Cube or the Mertz Cube, where I'm looking for eternal magic power level all stars, right? I'm actually looking for things that add to the context of this world or have like uniquely restricting costs. So it is beneficial that it is, as hard as it is to edit, it's also that hard to add to because, yeah, to your point, I can just add anything and it would be totally serviceable in this format. But there's not often things that feel like they fit into what I'm trying to do exactly. So that keeps it pretty restrained.
Well, so aside from having a clear goal as to what you're after in that environment, have you found that there are particular tools or techniques to help narrow down cards you're searching for?
When I'm building or as new cards come out?
I guess as new cards come out, it sounds like you're kind of in a place where you're just engaging with new sets, probably not digging a whole lot in the archives.
Yeah, I have dug very deep for this. I do think I legitimately looked at every card that existed like by curve and added them accordingly. It was pretty painstaking and time consuming.
That's amazing.
I don't know if it is. It definitely isn't a impressive use of time, but not the best. But I think going forward is just like I know the decks that I want to be good, and I will be very judgmental of new cards because the cognitive load of new card for radical recontextualization for players is also something to be mindful of. So it's like if I have too many readers in this format, that's going to be a bad time for everyone. So keeping it high and tight is the goal.
I like that. I think that's a good summary for a goal. Do you think of the garden as a clown shoes cube? Or as a
I
gimmick
don't.
cube or Anything like that?
Yeah, I do. I still wish there was a different verbiage than clown shoes. No shade to the progenitor of that verbiage, but it just doesn't resonate with me. But yes, I do think it would fit under that clown shoes or like emblem cube. It's definitely not your normal Magic, and I would not ever bring it to Cube Night where like we had a high density of like new folks playing because they're not going to have a good time.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow up. There is like, is that harder to market in a way, or like, is that harder to share with people because of that assessment?
It's not a cube that everybody will enjoy playing, is what I've gathered. Right? It's definitely a taxing draft. The gameplay can feel challenging at times, but I think of my friend Nick from our play group, and he has had such a journey with this cube where his first draft he was like not hyped, and then he was like, "No, I'm ready to go back in." And he came back in, and he had a sick deck, and each time he finds new things to do. And we recently, again in that same draft that Bones was in, we went to the finals, and I got there, but it was off of the back of a card that has been cut because it's too egregious, even in this context. But I think it's one of those environments where even if you train wreck your first draft, you're going to feel really energized to get back in there because other people have done such splashy and intriguing things. But I think what's most important is how I level set expectations going in. I literally will hand them a Lotus Field if they're asking questions, say, "This is your turn one land. You're going to try to manipulate this as best as you can. So keep that in mind when you're drafting." Because I think with these sort of clown shoes cubes, you need to give people an on ramp to success. Otherwise, they're not going to want to draft them again. So I think that's really crucial in these unique environments.
Yeah, first I want to say what a great trajectory to hear from a player going, "Nah, this isn't for me," to going, "Wait a second, I actually do want to do this again and again."
Yeah, I mean, it's been so fun to just see people's journeys with this environment because it is just like it's very easy to like have a bad time in it. So I appreciate all my friends who have helped me with the test drafts and have been good sports.
And then I wanted to camp just briefly on that idea of I don't want to use a term like clown shoes in a pejorative way. Like I don't want that to be something that is a negative thing. You know, we were joking about terminology earlier for a
Yeah.
cube block, but yeah, like how would you think about cubes in this space? Like, does it feel like it's different from a cube without rules restrictions or a cube without some sort of extra setup?
Yeah, I think verbiage for what these have is really crucial. I think for me, clown shoes has a clunky connotation, which makes sense. But I think there are some of these cubes that are a little more elegant than mine, like 100 ornithopters, where it's really grokkable and really clear. It's like, hey, you got 100 ornithopters in front of you.
It
This is
says it
what,
right on the tin.
yeah, it does what it says on the label, right? Or a Cascade Cube, where it's like maybe the rules interactions will be a little more complicated than you'd expect, but like, your first spell is Cascade on each turn. So it's like radical recontextualization doesn't always mean like clunky gameplay or design. And again, this is not, I don't want to like harp on this or be negative about someone else's verbiage because it's been well received. I think this is more just my sort of, I always am just like, clown shoes?
Well, yeah, and I didn't want to spend. It was more just to say like, I don't want to bounce past that without saying, "Hey, it's something I'm thinking about. And we probably want to be working on as a community, so we don't unintentionally put people down or put people off the trail of what they think they're going to experience in an environment."
Yeah, yeah. I think we as a community always come up with really brilliant verbiage, and there's a lot of folks who are great leaders in that. And this verbiage is always evolving, and it's always fun to see where it starts and where it ends up, right? There was like Power Max, and now we're using words like Eternal, which I think is like a really more digestible and easy to understand way in the context of Magic. It's just seeing the language evolve around Cube is I think really helpful, just because more people will come in, and the more you can understand a concept, the better it will be. And that's kind of what I hope we ultimately get to with these hyper recontextualized environments.
For sure. I'm imagining a world where we're talking about, oh, I have a Type One cube or I have a Type Two cube.
Don't tempt me, Cade, please. I want one thing, and it's disgusting, and it's a Type One cube.
That's so good. Well, thinking about terminology, thinking about different ideas. One of the things that I think you can speak to in a really interesting way is aesthetics. as I've given to understand, you have a background in fashion. Your cubes have a certain panache to them, I suppose. I remember pulling up. I forget which of your cubes, and I guess it's pulling from foil pricing because it made my eyes water, and I didn't realize that was what was happening. Can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about how you engage with aesthetics in your cube journey?
Yeah. So I think there's a really interesting overlap with fashion minded folks or folks that are into fashion and folks within the cube space specifically in Magic. I think aesthetics inform a lot of how we engage with our hobbies and the world at large, right? But in Magic and Cube particularly, as the designer, I get to be, for lack of a better word, a creative director, right? Like my eyes water too every time I look at the Cube Cobra pricing. And to be clear, I feel I'm very fortunate to have like such privilege and to have been able to accumulate these things over time. And for me, it's about each cube I have has a different not only gameplay design goal but aesthetic design goal, right? And for the Mertz cube, which is my eternal cube, I wanted that to feel as close to my like lost youth as a Magic player because like I grew up very working class family raised by like grandmothers, not to get heavy, and I never had the means to have like the most kitted out things where I was playing vintage, right? Where people are dropping moxes and lotuses and guru islands and these cards that are worth like shocking sums of money back then and forget about now, right? This was my sort of way to reclaim that like desire for like bling that I never had. I just remember like being able to get like a foil future sight for my storm deck and like a foil Darksteel Colossus back then. And I was so hyped and so proud, right? But this has been for me like a journey of using printings or treatments to capture emotions along with design guidelines. So like Mertz Cube is an eternal cube. I want it to look as close to like old school Magic. So everything that can be in a retro foil is in a retro foil. Certain things will be borderless when it feels right. So for me, that's planeswalkers are all borderless where they can be, or wraths are all borderless where they can be, because I like this sort of signaling to the player of like, hey, this has a freaky treatment, you should look twice at it, right? Or this has an old school vibe, like you should embrace that sensation. Where the Curio Cube, on the other hand, is like this was the time of like booster fun or whatever it was called, right? Where everything had these like bombastic and loud and crazy designs, and I was like, I have this cube that really just goes to classic Magic. Let me dabble in something that only plays like obscure or like loud borderless versions or retro frames or what. If it can't come in a classic treatment, it won't. Where the garden now is almost like hybrid, where it's like I want things that like Yawgmoth's Will, right? If money was no factor and I had to choose between the Judge promo, foil Yawgmoth's Will, which could be all foiled, like, and get my cube quote unquote closer to where I want it to be, or the classic original printing that's not foil, and it has the old retro frame, I want the retro frame because it emulates the era or the vibe or the sensation that I'm trying to curate. I think aesthetics help the world that you're trying to build as a cube designer. I think they're really crucial. And I think, aesthetics, much like fashion, are informed by life and personal experiences and are really human. And I think the same way one can have a personal style in how they dress or how they express themselves in this world. Cube design is simply another canvas that you can do that in.
So, do you think you can learn about cube designers just by looking at their cube?
Um, I think you can learn some things. I think it would be a disservice to folks to simply say that these things are representative of like who we truly are. But I think you can learn about someone's particularities, I'd say. Like you can understand how much someone prioritizes aesthetics at the very least, right? Where if someone is just kind of like, it's what I had around and that's fine by me, then that's totally great. If someone's like, I need these niche treatments, like that tells you that that person's particular about aesthetics in that way, at least. So I think it tells you maybe more about priorities more than who they are, or something about them beyond that.
I think that's a good assessment. And I'm glad to hear as you describe that too, that you have some outlets to try different things within that space too. It's not just all of my cubes look or feel this particular way.
Yeah, I think for me, I try to make each cube that I dabble in some percentage different than the other, and this has been a task that's been challenging, both like on an aesthetics level and just like a card pool level, because I try to keep those pools as divorced as possible. But the garden is, I think, the one that has the most overlap with like both of my other cubes, but like Mertz and Curio have no overlap for the most part, at least minimal, I should say.
Do you have design principles, I suppose, either aesthetically or just by way of crafting the environment for the garden that do translate to your other cubes?
Yeah, I think I really do just have like an affinity for retro frames. I like classic magic, you know? I really crave that youthful feeling of like kitchen table magic, where it's just like these are, red cards look like bricks, and swamp card yeah, black cards look like bubbling muck, and like there was just this like really visually like tactile feel. Like every card had a visual texture to me, and I don't feel that so much now with all of the really helpful design tools that Wizards put in, right? Like set and card numbers and all of that. But it's also like I want my, I want that old school vibe. I can't help it. I'm a magic boomer.
It's gritty.
Yeah, it is. It's
Like
gritty.
like you can it's tactile.
Yeah, it has that. I think also the fact that these treatments are not the normal frames is just another thing that I really resonate with, and gravitate towards. I love that it's not what you're going to see in every pack, right? It's not the modern frame.
Is that weird that that is reversed in a way where now the retro border, like the original borders, are the unusual ones to see?
Fortunately for me, I quit right around the time that the new frame came out, or whatever, like the golden era of modern frames, and that was like okay with me. But I think it's just kind of like times change. I can be okay with it, and also still seek out the things that I want. I think Magic is ultimately, to some extent, like you get to choose your own adventure, at least aesthetically speaking.
Scott, what advice would you offer to other designers as they're considering the things they're working on?
Mm, okay, great question. I stress to everybody to play test as quickly as you can. Do not be self-conscious. Do not feel worried about how people will receive it. Like people are just going to be happy to play Magic the Gathering, even if it goes a little off the rails. That is helpful data for you as the designer. You get to tweak those things, cut those things, learn from those mistakes in your next, future projects. I think testing super early is important, and I think starting small. I'll just echo what Bones said to me when I was really stuck. Start with your four-player version of this cube. Understand the through line and the base and the core of what you're trying to communicate to your drafters, and emulate in your environment, and really just like let that shine, and then you can kind of like add the fluff, for lack of a better word.
That's great. Well, Scott, I would be remiss if we didn't spend a moment chatting about an event you recently got to host. Talk about Cube for a Cause.
Oh yeah, thanks for asking. Cube for a Cause is something that's like really important to me, and it's been like a really incredible project that is in the sort of wheelhouse of events like Boston Cube Party and Vertex, and Cali Cube Champs, and all these other amazing grassroots events, right? I saw all these folks doing this, and I've always wanted to get involved in some form of magic organizing. Technically, this started with me starting Upkeep, which is just sort of our Wednesday play group here in Brooklyn. But I felt like we could do more with this platform and this kind of structure, which is why I wanted to introduce a way of contributing and giving back, in addition to like having fun and getting a group of magic players in the same room, and building a larger community that extends and does more than just sling spells, and does big X, little X, and left, right, left, right. I wanted folks to, through all of these actions, also take a stand. I wanted people to have a means to stand with causes that at least I believe in and do good as a community, right? If the professor can raise all this money for Trans Lifeline, why can't I, as a just some, 5'5" guy in Brooklyn, work with a bunch of other folks in my community and do the same thing, whatever the scale, right? To me, there's death by a thousand cuts, and there's also, we can contribute by a thousand efforts, and that's basically what I wanted Cube for a Cause to be. Is like, yes, we can run this tournament structure, but every cent after our operating costs is donated right back to that charity. And we've donated to UNRWA, Standing with Palestine. We've donated to Glitz, which is like a Black trans led advocacy group here in New York and beyond. And we'll have a new one for our next event in August. But like, we want to build a community that shares and adds to these values and uplifts folks that need help and support. Magic is a very privileged hobby. Why not do something good with the means and the energy that we're able to create as a group? That's really, that's my goal for it.
No, I love that idea of being able to take something that people enjoy and convert that into a force for good. What have you found most surprising about the process of putting an event like this together?
Honestly, everyone is very generous and trying to help. I think the thing that is most surprising for me is how hard it is just to reach folks. And, Cube is a unique format in Magic, right? This isn't like saying like, hey, come to this RC Cube. We're going to donate X% of your prize pool to this charity, right? I have to communicate this to different folks in different neighborhoods, different folks in different states. And I think it's really hard to just get people in the door, at least for me. New York is also exorbitantly expensive, which is cost prohibitive to stay in and visit. So we have like these acute challenges that are New York specific, but I'm not going to let that stop us from doing what we can. And, I felt those growing pains in our first event where we did not fully sell out thanks to, my efforts and a lot of help from like folks in the community. We were able to drum up, even in competition, for lack of a better word, the same weekend as MC Chicago, we managed to get fully sold out. We even had some folks that like wanted to pick up some of our merch that we made. I think it's really hard to get people in a room, cause or not. And I've experienced friction for Standing for Palestine. I've experienced friction for a lot of stuff along the way. But it's really just it is all hard, is the funny thing. But it also is extremely rewarding. And I have to say, like, this past time in particular, it felt like it clicked. We got everybody in the door. We got a good array of cubes. We had a better venue. The first one, I should say, had first time jitters and first time challenges. And now this time we were able to really do something that felt great and raise more money. And this event is, growing in its own way organically, and there are some exciting things to come that I can't talk about yet, but like, it's just going to keep getting bigger, or at the very least, it will do more is my goal. And, I think the challenge is actually figuring out how to take this energy and continue it beyond twice a year when we run the event, right? Like we run it in February-ish and August-ish. And I want to do more than just that.
Well, and how encouraging to hear that it's continuing too. When something's difficult, it can go one of two ways. And the fact that it's continuing is good.
It's true. And shameless plug, if anyone is listening and interested, we will be doing it again this coming August, the 23rd and the 24th. Mark your calendars, folks.
Exciting. Well, as we are trending toward wrapping up here, Scott, I get to ask you the question that you certainly know is coming here.
It's true.
If you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would you pick and who would you have do the illustration?
Okay. So it's tough. The artist is going to be the same no matter what. It's going to be Rebecca Guay, hands down. I love their work. And if I had to pick, I would be torn between Morphling or Quirion Dryad. I think those were those. Yeah, again, my age is showing, but
I was going to say if I didn't know your background that you described about playing in that era, I would know
yeah, I
now.
definitely gave it away. Yeah, known accumulated knowledge enjoyer, Scott Mertz. But Yeah, my first deck was mono blue control because it was like what I could afford, and then I built, Grow a Tog or Miracle Grow, depending on how you called it. I really hope we get back to fun deck names and constructed like that. But those two cards, I've won more games than Tendrils of Agony, that's for sure. So I think those would be my picks.
I remember as a young player hearing stories about Morphling because I started playing around the season of Etherling, and everybody was kind of talking about like, oh yeah, this isn't as good, and I was like, this seems brutal. What are you talking about? And then learning about real Morphling was eye opening.
Yeah, Morphling crawled so that Aether could walk.
Well, Scott, this has been a delight, and I'm so glad that we got to spend the time, we got to connect in this way. Certainly, I will include some links for Cube for a Cause upcoming, or at least point to where people can follow up on that. But if people want to learn more about the garden, or perhaps the Mertz Cube, or the Curio Cube, anything else you're working on, where should we point them?
Yeah, you can find me on Blue Sky at Scott Mertz. I don't use Twitter that much these days, and I will not call it any other name. But I'm still there, at the very least, laughing at a couple of tweets now and then, and grimacing at everything else. You can also find us in the Upkeep Discord. We would love to have you there. We talk all the time. And if you are in New York City, you can find me at Brooklyn Game Night every Wednesday at 7 p.m., where we run cube drafts, and we're always looking for new folks to join us, new cubes to draft, and new friends to make.
There you go. Great underline for the value and consistency that there's going to be an opportunity to draft every week.
It's true. It's true. Consistency is key.
Well, Scott, thank you so much again for your just your passion, your expertise, your spirit behind it all. It's really encouraging to hear, and I am excited for future opportunities to connect. So thank you.
Oh, Kate, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It was a great time.
I think about aesthetics some for myself, but it's not something I have any particular background or skill in. It's and hearing you describe, hey, these are just things I like, is encouraging in a way.
I think, and I don't know if this is like B-sides, but I think people would benefit from not being intimidated by aesthetics and actually just thinking, hey, after the mana drain, I was on a fashion forum called Super Future, which was like really formative for me. And there was like this internal meme whenever someone posted like a really bad outfit and it was getting kind of, you know, trial by fire is how you kind of learn how to dress better in early internet days. Um, and jokes aside, like the meme before memes were even called that was just like, this is my style, this is me, right? But I think
That's
there's like
yeah.
a full circle moment where it's like, hey, this is my style, this is me, right? You can do a cube in all borderless, you can do a cube in all retro frame, you can do whatever the heck you want, as long as you feel happy and that it looks in a way that resonates with you as the designer. Folks can take it or leave it, but know that there's never something wrong with your taste, because taste is always, it's subjective. It's not, there's no hard rule. There's guidelines and these other things, but like, rules are made to be broken, and personal preference is totally valid.
I have now stuck in my head. I don't know what to call the meme template where it's the kind of the novice on one side and the master on the other, that little curve.
Yep.
It's like, this is my style, this is me on
Yeah.
both on both ends. In the middle, it's like, well, no, but
Yeah.
you have
No, yeah, this is my style. This is me. That is actually, yeah, the like monk. I totally know what you're
it's
talking about.
yeah. Boy, what a
The
weird
full
world that
circle.
I can describe this meme to you. You're like, yeah, I know the one.
No, I know exactly. Yeah, what a time we live in, my friend. What a time.
Sorry to have to pause right quickly. My computer has frozen, and that's not
Uh-oh.
great. No, that's okay. You said you work in IT, right?
I do.
Awesome.
I don't know
Uh,
if it's the same kind of
no,
IT.
no. You may know a quick solution on it. The top bar of my screen has like disappeared from my browser, and I can't see my
Oh
mouse.
dear. Oh dear. Are you on a PC or a Mac?
I'm on a PC. I'm so sorry, Scott. This is the
No.
dumbest thing to possibly.
Can we include this? um,
This may be the post credit scene.
yeah, no, yeah. Have you tried
That's
turning it off and back on?